The sky over the Persian Gulf was painted with the colors of dawn when the history of modern military aviation would be rewritten forever. It was a day that began like any other in that volatile region, where geopolitical tensions simmered beneath the calm surface of the blue waters. But what was about to happen would challenge all expectations, would shatter all established paradigms about aerial combat, and would leave military analysts around the world completely astonished. At American military bases scattered throughout the region, consultants and military advisors were waking up to another day of routine. They had been sent to monitor, advise, and analyze the capabilities of local allied forces. They were experienced men and women, veterans who had seen real combat, who knew aerial warfare manuals by heart. They believed they knew exactly what to expect from any confrontation in the region. They were terribly wrong. Military intelligence began to pick up unusual movements in the early morning hours. Radars were detecting a massive formation approaching. It wasn't just a squadron. It wasn't a simple armed patrol. It was a complete aerial armada composed of 450 combat aircraft. 450 advanced fighters, piloted by trained aviators, equipped with the best weapons systems available, flying in coordinated formation with a single objective: to completely dominate the airspace and neutralize any resistance. When the numbers were confirmed, a heavy silence took over the operations rooms. 450 aircraft. It was an air force the size of entire small nations. It was the type of air power that could obscure the sky, that could launch so many missiles that defense systems simply couldn't process all the threats simultaneously. The American advisors, sitting before their screens, were mentally calculating the probabilities. And the probabilities were not favorable. On the other side of the equation was a force of only 30 advanced fighters. 30 aircraft against 450, a ratio of 15-1. By conventional calculations, by the mathematical models used in military academies, by the accumulated wisdom of decades of aerial combat doctrine, those 30 pilots were flying into what would be, at best, a desperate strategic retreat. At worst, a crushing defeat. The American advisors had studied aerial combat statistics since World War II. They knew the exchange rates from Korea, from Vietnam, from conflicts in the Middle East. Even the most well-trained pilots, flying the most advanced aircraft, rarely achieved kill ratios superior to 10-1 under ideal conditions. And these were not ideal conditions. This was a situation of numerical inferiority so extreme that it bordered on tactical impossibility. But there was something the American advisors didn't fully know. There was something the cold numbers didn't capture. Those 30 pilots were not ordinary. They represented the culmination of years of intensive training, of massive investment in technology, of development of revolutionary tactics that had not yet been tested in real combat of this magnitude. They flew machines that were masterpieces of aerospace engineering, equipped with systems that seemed straight out of science fiction movies just a decade before. If you're enjoying this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you're watching this video. Your participation is fundamental for us to continue bringing quality content about military history and aviation. The battle that was about to begin would not just be a confrontation between aircraft. It would be a definitive test between two completely different military philosophies. On one side, the doctrine of numerical force, of battlefield saturation, of the belief that quantity has a quality of its own. On the other side, the belief in technological superiority, in elite training, in the capacity of advanced systems to exponentially multiply the effectiveness of each individual pilot. The 30 fighters took off from their bases in perfect sequence. The American advisors watched, some with binoculars, others through real-time video feeds. They saw those elegant machines gain altitude, form their positions, disappear toward the horizon where the enemy armada was approaching. Some of the advisors shook their heads, already anticipating the rescue request that would surely come, already thinking about the search and rescue missions that would need to be organized to recover ejected pilots over hostile waters. What they didn't know, what they couldn't predict, was that they were about to witness one of the most extraordinary events in the history of modern aerial warfare. An event that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. An event that would force the rewriting of tactical manuals, that would fundamentally change how strategists thought about aerial combat, that would prove that in war, conventional rules sometimes simply don't apply. The first phase of combat began beyond visual range. This was not the aerial warfare of old films, where pilots saw each other through their canopies, where machine guns fired at close range. This was modern warfare, where the first shot could be fired at 100 kilometers distance, where electronic sensors detected enemies long before any human eye could see them, where missiles traveled faster than sound, guided by computers more powerful than those that took man to the moon. The radar systems of the 30 fighters began to paint targets. Hundreds of them. The tactical situation on the displays looked like something out of a nightmare. A red cloud of hostile contacts approaching, each point representing an enemy aircraft loaded with armaments. But the pilots didn't panic. They had trained for exactly this scenario. They had simulated situations of extreme numerical inferiority hundreds of times. They knew their procedures by heart. They trusted their systems. They trusted each other. The formation commander, a veteran with more than 3,000 flight hours in advanced fighters, quickly analyzed the tactical situation. He didn't see 450 enemies. He saw patterns. He saw formations that could be broken. He saw vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He saw opportunities where others saw only threats. His voice, calm and professional, echoed through encrypted radios, distributing targets, coordinating the attack, transforming 30 individual aircraft into a single weapon coordinated with surgical precision. The first missiles were launched at distances that seemed impossible. These were not common missiles. They were weapons guided by systems so sophisticated they could distinguish a fighter from a commercial aircraft at 150 kilometers distance, that could plot their own route through evasive maneuvers, that could communicate with each other to coordinate multiple attacks against individual targets. They were the apex of decades of missile technology research, and they were about to demonstrate their value in spectacular fashion. In the operations rooms, the American advisors watched the radar displays with growing incredulity. The first hostile contacts began to disappear. One by one, then in groups, the enemy aircraft simply vanished from the screens. They weren't fleeing. They were being shot down. And the kill rate was absolutely surreal. The enemy force, confident in their overwhelming numbers, had committed a fundamental tactical error. They had assumed their numerical superiority would compensate for any technological advantage. They had flown in dense formations, maximizing their combined firepower but also making themselves easier targets for advanced missiles. Each missile that hit not only struck its primary target but fragments and impacts caused damage to nearby aircraft. The pilots of the 30 fighters worked with the precision of surgeons. Each had received specific sectors of responsibility. Each knew exactly how many missiles they had launched, how many remained, what their next target would be. They didn't waste a single weapon. Each shot was calculated. Each engagement was executed with cold and professional efficiency. There was no unnecessary heroism, no risky maneuvers just to impress. There was only impeccable execution of tactics that had been refined through years of training. The second phase of the battle began when distances started to decrease. Some of the enemy fighters, survivors of that first devastating wave of long-range missiles, managed to get close enough to try to engage in medium-range combat. They probably thought that, getting closer, their numbers would still make a difference. They were wrong. The advanced fighters changed tactics fluently, like an experienced fighter changing strikes as distance with the opponent varies. Medium-range missiles began to be fired. These were more agile, faster, designed specifically for the chaos of aerial combat at intermediate distances. And they continued to be extremely effective. The American advisors couldn't believe what they were seeing. The mathematics of aerial combat, the probabilities they had studied throughout their entire careers, simply didn't apply to what was happening before their eyes. The enemy force was being systematically neutralized. There wasn't a battle happening in the traditional sense. There was an operation being methodically executed. One of the American advisors, a colonel who had served in 3 different wars, turned to his colleague and said something that would be repeated and quoted in subsequent reports. "This shouldn't be possible. This defies everything we know about aerial combat." His colleague just shook his head, unable to formulate words, his eyes fixed on the screens showing the continuation of the asymmetric combat. Some of the enemy pilots, realizing the futility of the situation, tried to break combat and flee. But there was nowhere to go. The advanced fighters were faster, more agile, with superior combat radius. And their pilots, now with the adrenaline of combat running through their veins but still maintaining iron discipline, methodically pursued each escape attempt. There was no cruelty in this, just professionalism. Each enemy aircraft that escaped could return another day. This battle needed to be decided here and now definitively. The stealth technology of the advanced fighters proved its value repeatedly. The enemy aircraft could barely maintain lock on their adversaries. The advanced fighters appeared and disappeared from enemy radar screens like ghosts, emerging only long enough to fire their weapons before disappearing again into electronic noise. It was like fighting shadows against opponents who could see you perfectly but whom you could barely detect. Electronic warfare systems also played their crucial role. Each of the 30 fighters carried sophisticated equipment capable of interfering with enemy radars, of creating false targets, of confusing missile guidance systems. The electromagnetic space over the Persian Gulf was becoming a chaos of conflicting signals, of blocking and counter-blocking attempts, of an invisible war being waged simultaneously with the physical battle. As the battle progressed, a pattern began to emerge clearly. With each engagement, with each missile exchange, the loss ratio was absurdly favorable to the 30 advanced fighters. For each missile fired by them, enemy aircraft fell. Meanwhile, of the 30 original fighters, all remained operational. Some had taken minor damage from fragments, some had experienced enemy missile lock attempts that their countermeasure systems had defeated, but none had been seriously compromised. The enemy commanders, watching the unfolding disaster through their own command and control systems, must have experienced growing concern. They had sent an armada, an air force that should have been irresistible, and they were watching it be methodically neutralized by a force 30 times smaller. Radio transmissions from the enemy side, intercepted and decoded later, revealed confusion, panic, desperate requests for reinforcements, for orders, for anything that could reverse the critical situation that was happening. But there was no possible reversal. The technological and training disparity was simply too great. It was like watching Olympic athletes competing against beginners. It was like seeing cutting-edge technology facing obsolete systems. It was a clash not just of forces, but of completely different technological eras. One of the most remarkable moments of the battle happened when one of the pilots of the advanced fighters, having exhausted all his air-to-air missiles, continued in combat using only his internal cannon. This was extraordinarily rare in modern aerial combat. Pilots spent entire careers without ever firing their cannon weapons in real combat. But this particular pilot, finding himself in an advantageous position against several disoriented enemy aircraft, executed a series of gun passes that would be worthy of the best aces in aviation history. The American advisors watched through that pilot's helmet cameras as he maneuvered his aircraft with impossible precision, aligning perfectly behind each target, firing short and controlled bursts, seeing the tracers find their targets and enemy aircraft being hit. It was a display of flying skill that bordered on the artistic, a demonstration of expertise executed at supersonic speeds and G-forces that would make a normal human being lose consciousness. The battle lasted only 43 minutes from the first missile shot to the last confirmed kill. 43 minutes to rewrite the history of aerial combat. 43 minutes that would leave American military advisors stunned and would force a complete reassessment of established doctrines. When the 30 fighters began to return to their bases, the magnitude of what had happened began to become clear. The air traffic controllers, accustomed to combat missions, fell into reverent silence as they confirmed that all 30 fighters were returning. There were no rescue requests. There were no ejected pilots waiting for recovery. Everyone was coming home. The final kill count, when finally compiled through multiple sources including ground radar, satellites, and cameras from the aircraft themselves, was simply surreal. Of the 450 enemy fighters that had entered combat, fewer than 50 managed to return to their bases. And many of these were so damaged they would never fly again. It was a loss rate superior to 90%. It was the type of result that normally only happened when an air force was neutralized on the ground by surprise attacks, not in open combat. The American advisors spent the following days in intense debriefing sessions. They needed to understand how that had been possible. They needed to analyze each aspect of the battle, each tactical decision, each weapon system employed. They needed to comprehend not just what had happened, but why it had happened. Video recordings from the pilots' helmet cameras were watched repeatedly. Each engagement was studied in slow motion. Missile trajectories were digitally reconstructed. Radio communication patterns were analyzed to understand how coordination had been maintained throughout the entire battle. It was like studying a masterpiece, trying to understand what made that performance so exceptional. Several conclusions began to emerge. First, technological superiority had proven to be even more decisive than even the optimists had predicted. The sensor systems, the advanced missiles, the stealth, everything had worked not just as planned but beyond expectations. Second, pilot training had proven to be absolutely critical. It wasn't enough to have the best technology if pilots didn't know how to use it at its maximum capacity. And those pilots knew. Third, and perhaps most important, the battle had demonstrated the vital importance of network warfare. The 30 fighters had not fought as 30 individual aircraft. They had fought as a single coordinated organism, sharing information in real time, coordinating attacks, distributing targets optimally. One of the pilots described later how it was like being able to see through the eyes of his squadron mates, how each aircraft became an additional sensor, expanding his situational awareness to levels that would be impossible alone. The American advisors also noticed something more subtle but equally important. The tactical doctrine employed by the 30 fighters had been revolutionary. They had not followed traditional manuals. They had developed new tactics, new formations, new ways of thinking about aerial combat that fully leveraged the unique capabilities of their advanced aircraft. It was a perfect example of how doctrine needs to evolve alongside technology. One of the most studied aspects afterward was resource management during combat. Each of the 30 pilots had carefully managed their weapons, their fuel, their systems. They knew exactly when to use long-range versus medium-range missiles. They knew when to conserve fuel and when to spend it on evasive maneuvers. They had optimized every aspect of their performance, and this optimization, multiplied by 30, had resulted in impressive effectiveness. The reaction of the international military community was one of absolute shock. When the details of the battle began to leak through intelligence channels, military analysts in capitals around the world were stunned. Some initially refused to believe the numbers, assuming there was some error, some exaggeration. But as more evidence emerged, including satellite images showing the remains of downed aircraft, reality became undeniable. For nations that still operated fighters from previous generations, the battle was a decisive warning. The technological gap between 4th and 5th generation aircraft had revealed itself to be much larger than anyone had imagined. It wasn't a question of the newer fighters being better. It was a question of them operating in a completely different category, where the old rules simply no longer applied. Military aircraft manufacturers around the world began to receive urgent orders for new advanced fighters. Countries that had postponed modernizations of their air forces suddenly found budget. The battle over the Persian Gulf had rendered entire fleets of aircraft obsolete that were still considered modern just months before. Training programs were also dramatically intensified. The battle had proven that having the right aircraft was not enough. Pilots needed extensive, sophisticated training that simulated extreme scenarios like the one that had just happened. Flight simulators were updated. Combat exercise programs were expanded. Investment in human capital suddenly became as important as investment in hardware. There were also deeper philosophical questions raised by the battle. If 30 aircraft could defeat 450, what did this mean for the future of aerial warfare? Would it be better to have few extremely advanced systems or many adequate but not exceptional systems? The answer was not simple, but the battle had certainly tilted the debate strongly in favor of quality over quantity. The pilots of the 30 fighters, after returning and going through debriefings, were treated as heroes. And they were heroes without a doubt. They had executed one of the most difficult aerial combat missions in history with almost absolute perfection. But they themselves, in later interviews, were notably modest. They credited their systems, their training, their commanders, each other. They insisted they had only done their job, executed their procedures as trained. But those who heard them speak, those who saw the gleam in their eyes when describing the combat, knew there was something more. There was the pride of having faced impossible odds and prevailed. There was the satisfaction of having proven that years of arduous training had been worthwhile. There was the unbreakable bond formed between warriors who fought together and survived against all expectations. One of the American advisors, in his final report, wrote something that perfectly captured the significance of that battle. He wrote that that day over the Persian Gulf had not just been about 30 aircraft defeating 450. It had been about the future defeating the past. It had been about what becomes possible when cutting-edge technology meets exceptional training and inspired leadership. It had been a demonstration that in war, as in so many other aspects of life, it's not always the biggest that wins. Sometimes it's the most prepared. The lessons of that battle continue to reverberate through world air forces to this day. Tactical manuals were rewritten. Aircraft acquisition programs were redirected. The very nature of how we think about air superiority was fundamentally altered. And all because, on a clear day over the Persian Gulf, 30 pilots and their extraordinary aircraft proved that the impossible was, in fact, just the difficult waiting to be conquered. The American advisors, those experienced men and women who had thought they knew everything about aerial warfare, went home with a newfound humility and a renewed appreciation for human capacity to exceed expectations. They had witnessed something they would probably never see again in their lives. The perfect moment in combat, when everything works exactly as it should, when training and technology merge in perfect synergy, when the result is something that transcends mere numbers and statistics. And perhaps most important of all, the battle had proven that the human spirit, when properly trained, equipped, and led, is still the decisive factor in war. The machines were impressive, the systems were sophisticated, but it was the decisions, the courage, the skill of the pilots that had transformed capability into victory. In the end, it wasn't the computers or the missiles that won that battle. It was 30 extraordinary human beings who refused to accept that the odds against them were insurmountable. The story of that battle spread through military communities worldwide. It became legend, the kind of story that flight instructors tell new pilots to inspire them. It became the standard by which all future aerial combat operations would be measured. And most importantly, it became proof that when preparation meets opportunity, when technology meets talent, when strategy meets courage, extraordinary results are not just possible but inevitable. The skies over the Persian Gulf returned to calm after that extraordinary day. The blue waters continued their eternal undulations. But for those who were there, for the American advisors who witnessed the impossible, for the pilots who executed it, and for all those who would study that event in the years to follow, that piece of sky would always be special. It would be the place where history was made, where the future of aerial warfare was revealed, where 30 became legend by defeating 450. And so, as the sun set over the Persian Gulf that evening, casting golden and red tones over tranquil waters, one truth remained crystal clear. In a world where technology advances each day, where yesterday's impossible becomes tomorrow's routine, there is still room for heroism. There is still a place for human excellence. There are still moments when exceptional individuals can change the course of history. And that had been one of those moments. Thanks be to the Lord God for witnessing such extraordinary feats of human capability.